I'm Francis Dearnley, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, after Trump makes the rare intervention of scolding Putin for one of the deadliest attacks on Kyiv of the war, we discuss the latest considerations of the coalition of the willing regarding stationing troops in Ukraine, and hear about the evolving nature of acts of resistance in the occupied territories and within Russia itself.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
It's the worst carnage that this world has seen since World War II.
Absolutely fascinating.
We are with you, not just today or tomorrow, but for 100 years.
Nous ne pouvons pas, comme Européens, laisser gagner la Russie en Ukraine.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
It's Friday, the 25th of April, 3 years and 61 days since the full-scale invasion began. And today, I'm joined by the Telegraph's Associate Editor of Defence, Dominic Nicholls, and researcher on the occupied territories, Illia Riepin. But first, over to Dom for the latest from the battlefront.
So let's start in Moscow, and a senior Russian general has been killed in an explosion there. So Russian state media saying this morning, a couple of hours ago actually, that a car exploded just outside a residential building in the Russian city of Balashikha. That's about 20 k's east of Moscow city centre. It's basically in the suburbs, really. They confirmed it killed one person. Now, the investigative committee of Russia later identified that person as Lieutenant General Yaroslav Moshkilik, who was the deputy chief of the main operations director of Russia's army. In a statement, they said, according to available data, the explosion occurred as a result of the detonation of a homemade explosive device. There's a picture, film, you'll see footage on social media. We're carrying it on the front of our website now of the moment the car is said to have exploded outside the residential block. It's a busy area. You can't see any other people there, but there are cars nearby. So it's not in a car park or it's not well away from other buildings. Russian media is saying that Moshkilik was walking past a VW Golf when the explosion occurred. They say the improvised explosive device was filled with striking elements with a diameter of about 6 millimetres, which is very specific. They say the car did not belong to Moshkilik. Now, it's not clear who was responsible for the attack, but Ukraine's security service, the SBU, has been known to target high-profile military officers on Russian soil. You may remember in December, Lieutenant General Igor Kirillov, who was the head of Russia's radiation, chemical and biological protection troops, was killed outside an apartment building when a bomb hidden in an electric scooter exploded. Killed him and his driver, I think. Now, that blast today came as Steve Witkoff's just arrived in Moscow for talks with Putin. And it's also, the blast happened in the same week, you may remember, of 3 other explosions in Moscow's central business district. So if it is, we don't know who it is, but if it is Ukraine's SBU, they're really taking action in Moscow this week. You may remember on Wednesday afternoon, a car exploded in the underground car park of a shopping mall, caused a fire, and Russian state media said that it was, they showed images of thick smoke billowing across the Afrimal city shopping centre, just on the banks of the river, the Moskva River running through Moscow. There were no official reports on casualties or the scale of the damage from Wednesday's blasts, but authorities said that the blaze was quickly brought under control after the explosions. But that incident did take place near where a Russian drone unit was filmed last week, actually, piloting a strike. You may remember Kremlin-aligned media posted and then pretty swiftly deleted a video showing the Espanola Brigade remotely piloting a drone strike from a high-rise residential building in Moscow. It's not clear whether Wednesday's explosions came as a result of a deliberate attack or if they're related to Ukraine in any way. So that was a kind of an update from Wednesday. There'll be more, I'm sure, as the day progresses about the blast this morning. Now, in Ukraine, Russian attacks yesterday killed 8, injured at least 22 others. There were 103 drones fired at Ukraine. One of those drones hit a residential block in the city of Pavlograd in Dnipropetrovsk Oblast, about 40 k's due east of Dnipro. That killed 3 people, including a child, injured at least another, over a dozen more, according to Governor Serhiy Lysak. No reason for that drone strike. It wasn't part of a coordinated attack. It was just another Thursday in Ukraine when Russia decided that they had to kill that child. Russia has another story. Russia's continued to use chemical weapons against Ukrainian forces and civilians in violation of the Chemical Weapons Convention, to which Russia is a signatory. This is reporting from the ISW, the Institute for the Study of War. Ukrainian deputy head of the main Department of Anti-Mine Action, Civil Protection and Environmental Safety, a chap called Colonel Valery Weber, said on Wednesday that Ukrainian forces had recorded 767 cases of Russia using chemical weapons just in March this year, and a total of 7,730 since February 2023. Now, Ukraine's military intelligence department said a couple of weeks ago that Russian forces have been dropping hand grenades with a type of riot control agent onto Ukrainian positions in western Zaporizhia Oblast, about 50 kilometers southeast of Zaporizhia city. Ukrainian military officials said at the time that they'd identified a capsule on one of the Russian Shahed drones that they'd brought down containing concentrated CS gas, a type of riot control agent that is banned under the Chemical Weapons Convention. ISW say that Russian sources back in 2023 were openly acknowledging that Russian forces have been dropping grenades carrying tear gas from drones as early as December of 23. Now, a couple more from me, Francis. NATO Secretary-General Mark Rutte arrived in Washington yesterday for 2 days of meetings. He did meet Donald Trump. There was no joint press conference, but reporting from it, Mark Rutte said, "We all agree in NATO that Russia is the long-term threat to NATO territory and to the whole of the Euro-Atlantic territory." Now, you might think he wouldn't have to say such a thing. You would have thought that's pretty obvious, but oh, how times have changed in the last 100 days, which we'll come on to a little bit later, I think. Now, on the so-called peace deal, Mr. Rutte said, "Ukrainians are really playing ball, and I think the ball is clearly in the Russian court now." He's there today as well. He's going to have office calls with Secretary of State Marco Rubio, Secretary of Defence Pete Hegseth and Mike Waltz, the National Security Advisor. And just one last one, Francis, a bit odd this. A Russian investigative outlet called Important Stories, Vazhnie Istory, I think, if I've not mangled my Russian there. They're reporting today that the son of a deputy director in the CIA has been killed in Ukraine fighting for Russia. This is Michael Gloss, a 21-year-old son of Julianne Galina Gloss, who serves as CIA Deputy Director for Digital Innovation. And his dad is Larry Gloss, US Navy veteran. So the son was killed in April last year, we're told. And according to documents seen by Important Stories, Mr. Gloss signed a contract with the Russian military in September 2023, having arrived in the country the month earlier, in August. Now, Euromaidan Press are saying that before joining the Russian army, Gloss had been travelling the world after leaving the College of the Atlantic in Maine, in the US, where he studied human ecology. His friends had described him as an environmental activist and anti-fascist who had expressed anger towards the United States. He apparently was killed in April last year, likely during a Russian offensive near Bakhmut in eastern Ukraine, but his family held his funeral in Fairfax County near Washington, D.C. last December. Bit of an odd one, that, Francis. And that's us up to date.
Well, thank you, Dom. We ended yesterday awaiting the response, of course, from the US to one of the deadliest attacks on Kyiv of the entire war. And a few hours after our broadcast, we got it, with President Trump posting on social media, "I am not happy with the Russian strikes on Kyiv. Not necessary and very bad timing. Vladimir, stop. 5,000 soldiers a week are dying. Let's get the peace deal done." Now, as others have pointed out, when is it necessary and very good timing to murder civilians? But at least it's something, and if it triggered even a slight reduction in missiles Russia fired overnight, perhaps that's a few innocent lives saved, though I should say there's no evidence of any such reduction. The post is revealing in other ways. Trump's criticism of President Zelensky was 4 times the length and was pretty eviscerating, whereas this reads like a sorrowful appeal to a friend, not least because of the use of Putin's first name. Shortly afterwards, Marco Rubio, the US Secretary of State, of course, doubled down on Trump's argument yesterday that the finish line for a peace deal is in sight. To quote him, "We're trying to end the destruction, and we've shown the path forward. We can see the finish line, but both of them have to get there. We're going to do everything we can to help them get there, but they have to ultimately say yes. But we are using a lot of pressure on both." Now, many would argue pressure is certainly being applied on the Ukrainians, but little on the Russians. Steve Witkoff, as you say, Dom, is about to meet with Putin again in Moscow. And it is revealing that Sergei Lavrov, Russia's foreign minister, said peace was moving in the right direction. It may well be for them. Now, I should add that there is some speculation that one of the reasons the attack the night before last was so especially deadly was due to the lack of Patriot interceptor stocks provided by the United States, and possibly even other early warning systems. There is reported to be unease in the Republican Party, better late than never, chaps, at the events of recent weeks, with senior figures like Lindsey Graham, Newt Gingrich, Mike Pence vocalising their critiques more overtly than before. To quote Mike Pence, Trump's former vice president, lest we forget, following last night's brutal assault on Kyiv, it's clear Putin has no interest in peace. Time to answer Russia's ongoing invasion with renewed American strength and give our ally the military support they need to win a victory for freedom. Now, it's for that reason that there is a widespread belief that if Trump sought to ease or end sanctions against Moscow, Congress would not back it. As I was saying earlier in the week, it may well be that this is as powerful as this White House will ever be in terms of the leverage it has over Congress and other nations, not least its allies, if we can even call them that anymore. Now, Dom mentioned NATO's Mark Rutte is in Washington at the moment, hastily arranged, we understand. He has also urged NATO's 32 member nations to devote more funds, equipment and political energy to the alliance. He said in his annual report, in 2025, we need to significantly increase our efforts to ensure NATO remains a key source of military advantage. Our continued freedom and prosperity depend on it. So let's look at the latest from the so-called coalition of the willing in Europe, which has noticeably become more focused, one might even say narrowed, to Britain and France in the last few weeks. On the former first, The Telegraph's Ben Riley-Smith got an exclusive interview with the Prime Minister yesterday aboard HMS Prince of Wales, where Sir Keir Starmer hit back at Trump over his critiques of Zelensky. To quote the Prime Minister, Moscow's overnight strikes are a real reminder that Russia is the aggressor here, and that is being felt by the Ukrainians, as it has been felt for 3 long years now. These attacks, these awful attacks, are a real human reminder of who is the aggressor and the cost to the Ukrainian people. Now, when asked whether Britain would ever recognise Russian possession of Crimea, his spokesman said, "Our position on Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity has not changed." Details of a 5-point set of demands from Kyiv have been shared with The Telegraph, revealing major differences still remain compared to America's 7-point plan we reported earlier in the week. At the centre of the demands is an insistence that Crimea is not formally recognised as Russian. One of Starmer's predecessors, Boris Johnson, has also launched a serious rebuke of Trump's approach yesterday, posting on X. Putin indiscriminately butchers more Ukrainian civilians, killing and injuring 100 in Kyiv, including children. And what is his reward under the latest peace proposals? The right to keep sovereign Ukrainian territory he has taken by violence and in breach of international law. The right to control Ukraine's destiny by forbidding NATO membership, the lifting of sanctions against Russia, an economic partnership with America, the chance to rebuild his armed forces for the next attack in a few short years' time. As for Ukraine, what do they get after 3 years of heroic resistance against a brutal and unprovoked invasion? What is their reward for the appalling sacrifices they have made, for the sake, as they have been endlessly told, of freedom and democracy around the world? Apart from the right to share their natural resources with the US, they get nothing. What is there in this deal that can realistically stop a third Russian invasion? Nothing. If we are to prevent more atrocities by Putin, then we must have a long-term, credible and above all properly funded security guarantee for Ukraine, a guarantee issued by the UK, the US and all Western allies. So that's Boris Johnson there, and as a result, we find ourselves again with Europe and the question of how far it is willing to go for Ukraine and, many would argue, their own long-term security. As such, many of you will find, I think, the following quite concerning about the direction of travel. The Times of London reports that Britain is becoming less inclined to send thousands of troops into Ukraine as part of a peacekeeping or reassurance force because the risks are deemed too high. As the Times writes, in an apparent softening of plans, Britain and Europe would no longer have a ground force guarding key cities, ports and power plants to secure the peace. It is hoped that this change in military support for Ukraine could see Moscow move its red lines to achieve a peace deal. Hold that thought, everyone. Instead, the focus for a security commitment to Ukraine would be on the reconstitution and rearmament of Kyiv's army, with protection from the air and sea. British and French military trainers would be sent to Western Ukraine. This would fulfill a commitment to put forces into the country. However, they would not be near the front, guard key installations, or be there to protect Ukrainian troops. Aircraft would protect Ukraine's airspace and provide air cover to Western troops on the ground. Turkey would play a maritime role under the most likely plans. Weapons from the UK and Europe would continue to flow, so Ukraine would be in a strong position should Russia break the terms. Nothing has yet been ruled out, and the Ministry of Defence is clear that Britain would not be prepared to abandon plans to send troops to the country in some capacity. A source involved in the discussion said of plans for a force of tens of thousands of ground troops, the risks are too high and the force is inadequate for such a task. This was always the UK's thought. It was France who wanted a more muscular approach. The trainers reassure by being there, but aren't a deterrence or protection force. The Times goes on. The need to deploy a huge force across Ukraine could affect Britain and Europe's commitment to NATO's eastern flank, some fear. A diplomatic source said, "We will move our position, but we want Moscow to break their red lines." It is understood that the UK insisted in Wednesday's talks in London that Britain and Europe must be able to rearm Ukraine as part of its security guarantees. The mood in Whitehall is bleak, with one government source saying it is a serious moment. The pressure needs to be ramped up on Russia, he said. Now, I should add, a cabinet minister has rejected the suggestion that the UK was set to abandon plans to send troops to Ukraine, saying that all options remain on the table. But if these reports are true, it represents a significant climb down, seemingly predicated on fears of being spread too thin, of escalation, and by this account, a belief that Putin will not stop the fighting if he believes that Western troops will be stationed in Ukraine afterwards. And thus there has to be a guarantee they will not be there if there is to be any chance of a ceasefire. But many would argue that he is not inclined to stop fighting anyway, and further, that he only responds to strength. And thus, as we've seen throughout the entire war, this will be seen as an invitation to escalate rather than de-escalate. My sense, from talking to people in London, is that much of the concern within the coalition of the willing is based around timescales, that they need more time to prepare supply chains, weapons procurement, and increase troops' numbers. If that is true, it only underscores once again the tragedy of Europe's inaction since the full-scale invasion. It's noteworthy that the French are seen as being more hawkish than the Brits within the coalition. Who'd have thought that 3 years ago? Only yesterday, the new French ambassador to Sweden said this: "Our French vital interests also include the interests of our allies. In that sense, the nuclear umbrella also covers our allies and, of course, Sweden among them." That nuclear deterrent, independent of the United States, is a key key card in all of this, and expect us to continue talking about it in the weeks and months ahead. I've spoken for long enough, but just another couple of very quick updates. A federal judge has ordered the Trump administration to restore all jobs and funding for the Voice of America and other US-backed news outlets, ruling that the efforts to dismantle it violated the law and constitution. So over 1,300 Voice of America employees, including about 1,000 journalists, were, of course, placed on leave following Trump's order. They are now expected to be able to be allowed to go back to work, although the White House is likely to appeal. Finally, the body of Ukrainian journalist Victoria Roshina, who died after torture in Russian captivity, has been formally identified after it was brought back to Ukraine in late February. A spokesman said from the Interior Ministry, given the torture and the condition of her body, her family requested not one but several DNA examinations. As far as I know, the examinations were carried out not only in Ukraine but also abroad to ensure that it was Victoria. And I know several of our listeners knew Victoria personally, and of course our thoughts are with you. Now, let's turn to our fortnightly segment on resistance in the occupied territories. And we're delighted to be joined by Illia Riepin, who works with Dr. Jade McGlynn on compiling the information on the latest activities. Jade is away this week. She'll be back soon. Illia, welcome to Ukraine the Latest, and thank you for all of your efforts on behalf of all of those listeners who really appreciate this segment. Where do you want to start?
Hello, thank you for the invitation. It's a real honor to join you on the Ukraine the Latest podcast. I am a research assistant of Dr. Jade McGlynn, and today I will present you the result of Ukrainian resistance activity from the recent periods. Glad to finally talk live. Between 10 and 21st of April, Ukrainian resistance groups carried out at least 11 confirmed actions across occupied Ukrainian territories. This includes, as usual, sabotage, arson, infrastructure disruption, and of course, symbolic non-violent actions. Most of the activities during this period were focused on the military and logistic targets, and most cases were recorded in the southern territories, including, of course, Crimea. We mentioned that a key trend in this 2 weeks period is the increased focus on the disruptive transport and communication infrastructure. For example, a particularly striking example of direct sabotage occurred on the Donetsk front, where an agent from the Atesh, I guess you already know this movement, we talk regularly about them, this agent successfully set fire onto a Russian tank. And if you remember, 2 reports ago, we noted that guerrillas from the Srok organization were laying mines and different explosives on the occupiers' transport roads. And today we have found evidence of the successful detonation of these mines and the destruction of the Russian military vehicles. But one of the most important events of this reporting period was the release of geolocation-based intelligence collected by Ukrainian partisans and published by Petro Drushenko, the former deputy mayor of the temporarily occupied Mariupol. Although the resistance groups typically avoid sharing the operational details related to the movement of the enemy, military vehicles, equipment, so on, this time they presented the clear evidence that tracking and the reporting Russian troop movements directly contributes to the action of the resistance. By that I mean that partisans working undercover in the occupied territories monitored the relocation of the military convoy in the Mariupol-Orikhiv direction, and using photos, video, and confirmed geotags, they passed this data to Ukrainian defense forces, and as a result, the Russian convoy was later hit by a coordinated strike in one of the locations that was spotted. Another important development is the growing use of the non-violent and psychological tactics. For example, in Feodosia, it's a part of Crimea. The underground movement Anti-Smersh spread threatening messages through the leaflets warning non-collaborators. The other example, if you remember, Francis, like last time we showed the greeting from the Mariupol in English. And this time we spotted a similar message in English, but from the Melitopol. It's a southern part of Ukraine, the part of Zaporizhia region. Honestly, it was a general information for Francis for this period, and now I guess we can focus on case-by-case analysis. The first that we found happened on April 11th. It was this mines detonation by Throg organization. We cannot prove the location, we cannot find the proof, but we know that they usually works on the southern parts of Zaporizhia region, so it happens somewhere there on the roads between cities. The second action happened in Crimea, Prolitne city. Also, the group was Anti-Smersh that I already announced. They blown up the electric cabinet, and I guess it's damaged enemy equipment. Also, as I already told you about Donetsk direction, where the attaché agent set the tank on fire. Also, attaché this week worked on the Melitopol. They also destroyed the communications box, relay cabinets. In Mariupol, a fire was started in a building used by the occupiers. As usual, I guess it's the Mariupol resistance of my native city. In Crimea, in Razdolne, the Crimean partisans destroyed a Russian radar system. It was on the top of the hill, and it was one of the oldest from Soviet era. It's all our findings in Ukrainian territory, but we also spotted some actions in Russia. In Tver region, it's the city that calls Ostakhov. Ukrainian resistance also destroyed the car of someone in the Russian military industry. And the same action happened in the Smolensk. It's the Moscow region. A car was damaged by the Civil Power. Civil Power is an organization that's part of attaché movement, but that act only on Russian territory. That is all from my side.
Well, thank you very much, Illia, and we look forward to hearing the latest updates on this vital subject in a couple of weeks' time. But returning to Dom now, it's the end of a week and there's quite a lot of subjects that we thought it would be interesting to discuss. Of course, next week marks 100 days of Trump's second presidency. Now, of course, 100 days, it's an arbitrary marker, but nonetheless, it is a yardstick. Dom, where do you want to start on reflecting on that? And of course, we'll get into Europe and other subjects later on. Is this a significant milestone? What can we register from it at the present moment?
Yeah, thanks, Francis. As you say, 100 days, it's just a largely meaningless yardstick, but it is taken as, it seems to be the culture now to mark the first 100 days of a new presidency or prime minister or government or what have you. And of course, this one has particular resonance because Donald Trump said, well, he says it's a joke now that he was going to solve the Ukraine war in 24 hours. Apparently that was a joke. But he then did say 100 days. So clearly this does have particular resonance. But for me, looking back, and obviously this is looking forward as well, but if we are to view this US administration's main concern and almost its raison d'etre to counter the rise of the challenge from China as they see it, then I think we should ask ourselves, has Donald Trump and his administration shown themselves to be, firstly, sophisticated consumers of intelligence, and secondly, sophisticated practitioners of international security diplomacy? I'm not convinced they have done. I mean, if you look at certain bits and pieces, for example, sacking, one of the first things Donald Trump did was sack General Brown, the head of the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, and other senior military leaders. Of course, it's in the gift of the president to have whoever he or she wishes, but that's quite a bold move straight out of the blocks to sack the head of the armed forces. Then, of course, you've got those intelligence leaks on the Signal messaging app, for which Pete Hegseth seems to have got away with it. I used the analogy the other day about Hillary Clinton and her emails, and I got some responses with people almost willfully just turning the debate onto Hillary Clinton again and saying, so do you forgive her? Do you think it's... And I was saying, it's not, look, forget it. I'm just saying, is that now the benchmark? Anything is game, regardless of what the security classification is. You can do whatever you like with intelligence and other sort of sensitive information, as long as it's not as bad as Hillary Clinton. That goes against the whole point of having a security classification in the first place. Anyway, so you've got all the Signal stuff. Then you've got the treatment of allies and adversaries. And if you look at how Donald Trump and the administration have been, well, hostile, cool towards Ukraine and President Zelensky. They've had the bust up in the Oval Office, and then just the way that they've been treating the issue of the war compared to the forgiving or the excusing approach they've taken to Russia's behaviour. That strike in Sumy a couple of weeks ago was a mistake. It's very, very odd, the behaviour. So all these things together, what does this say about their attitude to China? How has Donald Trump's dealing over the war in Ukraine impacted this challenge of China? And I don't think, I mean, forget Moscow and Putin for a moment, I don't think Xi Jinping and the Chinese would be at all concerned by what they see. I think they'll be absolutely heartened at these acts of undermining the rules-based order that has brought such prosperity and peace to the world. Yeah, they'll be very happy to see what's been happening in the first 100 days as they say, look at Taiwan, and B, look at eroding the power of the dollar as the world's global reserve currency. They'd be very, very happy to see what's happened there, particularly all the chaos about the tariffs. So no, if China is the benchmark against which Donald Trump has set himself and that his administration, then I don't think these first 100 days have particularly put America on the front foot in that regard.
I agree, and I think just to add to that, another calculation in the European context that we'll get to in a moment is that if we are looking at a continent that is gradually, slowly mobilizing, when you're talking about those logistics supply chains, if there is caution and concern about relationships being built with the United States in terms of weapons and key parts, you could say that in the short term, the only other option available is China. So they will actually be being compelled, and I've heard this from sources, they will be compelled to be building relations with China for defensive parts to fight the war in Ukraine and for their own armed forces. I mean, that is an extraordinary shift, which cannot be favourable to the United States' own interests in the future theatre in the Pacific. But this feels like a good moment to bring us on to Europe. Dom, obviously I was reporting earlier on this Times analysis, and Phillips O'Brien, of course, friend of the podcast, well-known analyst of the war, professor at St Andrews, has said in his newsletter today that, pretty blunt, European policymakers have failed. It's been exactly 38 months since the Russians launched their full-scale invasion. That's 1,150 days that policymakers have had to plan and react. Sadly, they've been better at giving speeches than actually taking the needed steps for Europeans to look after themselves. If rhetoric had been enough, Europe would be in great shape. Do you agree with that? What was your reaction to that Times report?
Well, so, I mean, I think I do agree with Philip O'Brien's words there. There have been some great speeches, but actually not an awful lot else. Now, we see the defence budgets of a number of European nations going up. The further north and the further east you go in Europe, yeah, those budgets are, but not everywhere. I think elsewhere in his newsletter, he says that the European average defence spending at the moment is 1.9%. I mean, that's under the benchmark 2% for NATO. So, yeah, I mean, there's been, as he says, some good words, but we need to see more action. And I think France and UK and Germany, maybe less so Germany now, but I think that we possibly run the risk of losing the diplomatic momentum to the east. If you think about the words that are coming out of Poland and Baltic states. Now, I don't mean that in terms of when I say losing the momentum, it's not a competition, but actually the big powerhouses in terms of the economy and the armed forces, although Poland's armed forces are pretty massive now and rearming. But yeah, UK, France and Germany need to back up their words with action, the same as the countries further east are doing. As for the Times article, I think it's quite interesting. I thought the comment there that the potential forces, as in British boots on the ground, forces are inadequate for such a task. Yes, I mean, we've talked about that. You need multiple tens of thousands to be able to put a decent force in and keep it going for any amount of time with the rule mod and what have you. The other phrase, though, the risk too high, well, I might take issue with that because that's a political calculation. So I think it's a little bit sharp of whichever unnamed official that was to say, to judge already that the risk was too high when we don't actually know the shape of this thing. And I'll just point you back to, I think it was Tuesday when Parliament in Britain met again after the Easter recess, and John Healey, the Defence Secretary, gave that speech to the House of Commons where he said, and I pointed out the specific verbs that he used. He said that the coalition of the willing would secure the sky and the sea and support the development of the Ukrainian armed forces. So to secure the sky and sea is a very big military task. Doesn't necessarily need a lot of boots on the ground in the country, but is still a very weighty task. So I don't see these two things, don't see John Healey's statement on Tuesday and this article in the Times as being out of kilter with each other.
Interesting. I think just to add to what you were saying about the eastern flank, NATO's eastern flank, it is concerning to me how absent Poland in particular has been from the coalition of the willing foremost conversations, it seems. I was obviously saying earlier on that it's France and Britain that have been really the driving force of this, but this needs to be a huge coalition force because of the limitations we've talked about on the podcast so many times. And yet there doesn't seem to be, at the moment at least, that idea of everybody really, really rallying together in a meaningful sense. And also, where are the Germans in this coalition? It's not clear at the moment exactly. They obviously are talking a lot at the moment about rearmament and everything else, but they don't seem to be as plugged in as one might expect given the gravity of the situation. I mean, Phillips in his newsletter also talks about the fact that many European states seem to be relying on Washington lobbyists with MAGA ties for their advice. To quote him, they are being told to be agreeable little boys, to suck up to Trump, to try and get crumbs from the table, because that is what MAGA acolytes need to do to succeed. The inability of European states to think for themselves so far has been one of the great problems. What's your reaction to that, and perhaps what I was just saying there about Poland and the eastern flank not being as involved as we might like to see?
Yeah, I mean, that's quite a stark picture he paints there, that the court of Donald Trump, that it won't brook dissenting voices, actually doesn't seem interested in inviting challenge or alternative ideas. That can't be a healthy way to run an administration. And if that's, as Philip says, if that's what Europe is now finding, that the only way they're going to get a voice is to parrot to him what he wants to hear, well, that's no way to take the debate forward. So, again, this is only going to serve to drive a wedge, or drive the wedge even further between the US and the rest of the NATO alliance and Europe. So I don't think that's particularly a good thing. But we've said, how many times have we said this is for Europe to get its act together? I mean,
we should start a piggy bank.
We should, yeah, a swear jar. But when are we going to see something? I mean, it's almost as if everyone's now waiting for Friedrich Merz to get his feet under the table and see what he's going to say and what is going on. And Donald Trump is driving the agenda at the moment, and people just seem to be of the opinion that there's no point in coming out with a policy of their own because they'll just have to change it or react to whatever Donald Trump does next. And that's not a good way of running your foreign policy.
No, absolutely. And we're all going to feel the impacts of that. And again, I think there's an argument that Phillips alludes to in his newsletter that Ukraine has given Europe the most precious gift it can, which is time. And I think a lot of these calculations that are being made are assuming, in some capitals at least, that this is really only uniquely about Ukraine, and that there isn't as much of a danger of an escalation beyond that. And so for some, they look at the Ukraine situation, they want the war to stop. They, of course, want to see Ukraine do as well as possible, but they do not necessarily see themselves as being in the firing line in the short to medium term. And that seems to be a gulf of understanding. And you could point at almost at different leaders in different countries at different times, holding different views on that question. But Dom, do you think there's anything that can happen for an actual invasion by Russia of, say, Estonia or Latvia or something like that would actually wake them up from their slumber? Or do you think that there is a possibility that we will get that far-sightedness necessary to see a real proactiveness?
I'm a bit pessimistic, to be perfectly honest, because we don't have to wait to see this. This is happening today. These sabotage attacks across Europe, either directly by the alleged the GRU and FSB or through proxies, if there's no sort of Russian footprint in various countries. I mean, these attacks are happening now. And I think the phrase sort of hybrid warfare or grey zone warfare has been around for a few years now. You can't be in a senior position in power in a Western democracy and not know what that means. And yet it doesn't seem to have impacted policy making and decision making yet, because we are under attack from Russia. I mean, 2018, there was a Novichok attack here on the streets of Britain that killed Dawn Sturgis. This happens. Now, there was a very considered response to that when the world came together and kicked out a load of Russian intelligence officers, which is one of the reasons why they're having to rely on local proxies and useful idiots and what have you. So the world can come together, Europe can come together when there's a galvanizing event such as the Novichok attack. So I don't know why it's not happening now when there's ample evidence that there are malign Russian activities being conducted on European soil, these parcel bombs that were found in DHL warehouses and what have you. I mean, we know this stuff. Why it's not being treated as an attack? And I'm not suggesting we go, right, it's Article 5, let's go to war. But that doesn't seem to have left an impression in the minds of policymakers.
If we were being generous, of course, as I said yesterday, you'd say that many European officials do know this deep down and are, in a sense, just trying to play the United States for time whilst they find time to prepare. So rather than this being about them not waking up, they have woken up, but they have to keep, in a sense, the facade going. But that's a very optimistic interpretation put forward by some, whereas I just don't quite get that sense that really deep down the shift has been made, which of course is deeply concerning and one which will have ramifications not only now in the war that's being fought, but in the possibility of the risk of future wars to come. But what do you think? We're really interested always in hearing your perspective, and it shapes how we approach our reporting. I should add, there's one other subject which I think it might be just quite helpful for us to touch on, Dom, and we haven't talked about this in advance, so this is very free-flowing, guys, so be kind. We know many of you are upset at the fact that Trump is still in the introduction, the title sequence to the podcast. And just to be clear, just because somebody is in the title sequence does not mean that we're endorsing their viewpoint. We've had a very clear approach to this, which is the key players of the war on the Western side are featured there. So we change out the prime ministers, we change out the leaders, and we have to, in a sense, deal with the leaders that we've got. I think that's felt our point of view from the start, that there's no point in hiding from the fact that Trump is a key player, whether we like it or not. But perhaps we are entering a field now, a space where the United States is no longer going to be one of the key players in this war, if indeed they pull out. But Dom, how would you respond to those who've written some pretty strongly worded emails on this?
Yeah, I mean, thanks as ever for writing to us, and we do talk about it. A lot of people are annoyed that we still keep Trump's words in there, but no, I'm with you on this one, Francis. Whether we like it or not, he's the president of the United States of America. He is a very significant figure on the world stage right now. So yes, I'm afraid he's going to have to stay unless we change the whole sort of format. But I think that's what it's there for, is to reflect who the main players are right now.
Yeah, absolutely. But as I say, the direction of travel may well change, and there may be a particular remark which means that that's the one that really defines his approach to the war in the coming months, and in which case we will change that, and we may even need to throw in some more European leaders from the Eastern Front if things begin to really shift. But as I say, we hear you, everyone. We're not ignoring your critique on this, but that's our view. But we welcome yours. We always welcome yours.
The troubles in Northern Ireland are raging. Civilians find themselves caught in the crosshairs.
My father was covered in blood.
Behind the violence, there's a sinister secret.
He is probably the most high-profile British agent that we know of to date.
A covert unit of the British Army is connected to a string of murders.
If you could recruit a terrorist, that's the cream on the cake.
And the fight for justice continues.
There wasn't just one agent. Most of them were agents.
The latest podcast from The Telegraph. I'm Cara McGugan, and this is Bed of Lies. Search Bed of Lies wherever you're listening to this.
To end the week, something a bit different. Janine Natalya Clark, a professor at the University of Birmingham and listener to the podcast, has since the invasion been collating recordings from Ukraine for an online exhibition about the experiences of animals during the war. Let's hear a selection of those with her commentary.
We are very used to seeing images of war on the news and in social media, but what about the sounds of war? When we think about these sounds, we probably think first and foremost about the sounds of combat, of explosions, of gunfire, and so on. In my ongoing work on the Russia-Ukraine war, I am interested in what we can learn from sound about some of the war's impacts, and in particular about some of its effects on animals. The first recording was made by an interviewee in Dnipro, a city in central Ukraine. The recording is a powerful sonic illustration of how some animals react to the abnormal sounds of war, in this case the sound of an air raid siren. What is interesting about the recording is that in addition to the dogs barking and one dog howling, you can hear the sound of birds tweeting throughout. This makes me think of a comment by the French composer Michel Chion. He said, "There is a detail that often appears in the testimonies of World War II, the birds that continue to sing despite the sound of detonations." In this recording, the birds continue to sing despite the sound of the air raid siren. The larger point is that there is important research to be done on some of the ways that the war has affected birds and other animals. One of my interviewees, an ornithologist, talked, for example, about her concerns regarding the potential loss of a specific chaffinch dialect, the lower Dnipro dialect. She told me that this dialect is not widespread dialect, and if the small area in which it exists, namely forests in the steppe zone of Ukraine, is destroyed, the dialect itself can be lost. The second recording was made by a zoologist. He made the recording in Luhansk region in 2013, a year before the start of the conflict in eastern Ukraine. The recording captures the sound of a steppe marmot, and the interviewee shared it to emphasize that this is a sound that he greatly misses. The area in which he made the recording is now under Russian occupation, and therefore little is known about the fate of animals in the area. The third recording was made in a park in Kyiv. It was made by the director of Ukraine's oldest nature reserve, which is called Askania Nova, and it's in Kherson region. Askania Nova has been under Russian occupation since the start of the full-scale invasion, and it now has a new Russian director. In speaking about the recording, which captures bird sounds, the interviewee reflected on his time in Askania Nova and spoke about his feelings of nostalgia. He also talked about some of the ways that the war has affected animals in Askania Nova. He particularly highlighted the impact of low-flying aircraft, which the animals are not used to. The fear caused by the noise has led to some animals being crushed as they try to escape. Something that every interviewee has spoken about is the impact on animals of the destruction of the Kakhovka Dam in Kherson region in June 2023. Unfortunately, I don't have any recordings from the site of the former dam, but one of the interviewees whom I interviewed told me, and I quote, "After the explosion of the dam, all ecosystems just died. I was in this place after the catastrophe. There were dead fish everywhere, and you can't help because there is just death. There are dead mollusks, thousands, and you walk and you can hear the sound when you're walking on their shells, and they died. There are thousands of other creatures that also died." These words illustrate the concept of ecological silencing, which makes me think in turn about Rachel Carson's acclaimed book, Silent Spring. The crucial point is that when nature falls silent, this is a powerful warning that something is very wrong. The fourth recording that I would like to share was made by a marine biologist working on Gerald Hatch Island in the Black Sea. It was made before the start of the full-scale invasion. The point she wanted to emphasize is that the sound of the sea and the accessibility of the sea have changed as a result of the war. She also emphasized the mass deaths of cetaceans such as porpoises and dolphins that have been reported. These deaths are likely linked to the war, including the impact of explosions and naval sonar. What is interesting here is that several interviewees made the point that in some respects the war has benefited nature due to reduced human pressures. One example of these reduced human pressures is the ban on hunting that currently exists in Ukraine. This ban has allowed some populations of wild animals to grow.
Professor Janine Natalya Clark there. You'll find a link in the show notes to the exhibition Soundscape website. It was made possible with public engagement funding from the University of Birmingham, and her research was supported by the Leverhulme Trust. Thanks to her and Paul Olawade for his assistance in editing the recordings. Let's turn to our final thoughts now then. Dom, it's the end of another significant week. Where do you want to leave listeners?
Well, a couple, if I may. Firstly, the wolf closest to the sledge. Keep your eye on Moscow and Steve Witkoff's meeting out there. In particular, any comment afterwards, any reference to sanctions, i.e. lifting up sanctions against Russia, any comment about the 7-point peace plan and Crimea and the legal status. So the language that's going to come out of that, I think, will be very telling. We will need to have a close look at that. And my second thought was just kind of finishing up what we were discussing earlier on. If I were to ask you, Francis, would you hand on heart say that there are no Western leaders now secretly thinking Donald Trump's going to force a peace deal on Ukraine, whether they like it or not. Therefore, we don't have to come up with a policy position over Russia. We don't have to put a huge amount of effort into trying to increase our defence budgets and win the argument with our publics. We don't have to do a huge amount there in terms of NATO, because it will all go away soon. We'll go back to normal. I couldn't absolutely say, no, I don't think that thought is being entertained anywhere in the heads of any leaders. And I think that's quite worrying.
That's my fear too. But I would say I think history will judge them, if that is the case. Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph, created by David Knowles. To support our work and to stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from Ukraine, please subscribe to The Telegraph at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. We also have a Ukraine live blog on our website where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. We also do the same for other breaking international stories. If you appreciated this podcast, please follow Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app and leave us a review, as it helps others find the show. Please also share it with those who may not be aware we exist in your language. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We do continue to read every message. You can also contact us directly on X. You can find our handles in the description for this episode. We're especially interested to hear where you're listening from around the world. Thank you, and best wishes from London.